1 Peter 5:8. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. So I wasn't raised in a religious household by any means. My mom, who was a single mom, took my brother and I to church on Easters, but as far as religion goes, that's about it. We didn't read the Bible or pray with meals. It was my grandmother, with whom I practically lived, who carried the faith in the family. Her 400 square foot apartment was filled with little angel statues and pictures of Jesus and Mary. She prayed alone in her room at night, prayed over me, read the Bible nightly, and toward the end, I read the Bible to her. She'd briefly tell me about Jesus, so I knew about him, but I didn't know him, and for some reason I had no desire to know him. Looking back, I see myself as a child on a boat at the mercy of the waves as they try to pull me out to the darkness of the sea. And my grandmother was my anchor, my lighthouse. She kept me grounded. So I wasn't close to my biological dad. I recall being very uncomfortable with him. And I could tell from an early age that he was not a good person. A woman from court would accompany him during his visits and take notes in the corner. He was an extremely negative force upon my family. I could go on and on with stories that portray his character, but I think this speaks volumes. When I was 24, he killed himself, and from what I was told, no one claimed his body. Nobody wanted anything to do with him, even in death. I'm saying these things not to speak ill, but because they will be referred to later. So I wasn't a horrible kid growing up. I was off, still am. I was very quiet, so much so that I made other quiet kids look talkative. And people would point it out, still do, but I had a horrible temper. 0 to 100 in a blink. I'd get mad and hit other kids. And I had nightmares at the time that seemed to be almost demonic. In one dream, I walked into my grandma's closet. It was dark. There was this distant chanting, and I pulled back the clothes hanging and saw a Bible on the ground. Light was coming from it. I realized the chanting was coming from the Bible. It was getting louder. Then I realized what it was saying. Murderer, 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 over and over again. I awoke with this horrible, dreadful feeling that I still feel today anytime I think back to that dream. In another dream, the worst, I was stuck alone outside at night. From behind the tree in the yard, I could see a figure that looked like the Grim Reaper. It lunged at me and I awoke screaming. Isaiah 59:2. Your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God. So then my mom met someone, Tony. They got married and he moved us 800 miles away from my home, Knoxville, Tennessee, to Dallas, Texas. I was about 13 at the time, just beginning to develop friends, getting closer to family. It was a rather traumatic experience for my family and I. It may sound dramatic, but I desperately did not want to move. I actually tried running away at one point, made it a whopping 24 hours before my friend turned his phone on and heard voicemails from Tony, who was, at this point, my adoptive dad. But the real reason this move was so big to me was because it was a separation from my anchor, my grandmother, my nanny. Knoxville and Dallas are different worlds. The change in environments gave me whiplash. Knoxville is older, smaller, more country, there's mountains. I was raised by addicts, alcoholics, disability, food stamps, and bologna on white bread. Now here I was in one of the safest towns in America, where they have sidewalks on every street, HOA in every neighborhood, and where everyone seemed to go to sleep at the exact same time. As stupid as it sounds, I just could not stand the place. And as the new kid, I stood out, but I was quiet, remember? So I stood out in a bad way. This led to what was initially me being occasionally picked on and what would later escalate to more. After a while, I did meet people, but they weren't the people I needed to be involved with. These kids quickly introduced me to a whole new way of life that I never knew existed, and it was called atheism. For whatever reason, I fell in love with it. It was, at the time, logical, dark, rebellious. Then they introduced me to music that was just as dark. As a matter of fact, it was downright satanic. It was angry and loud, and I felt it matched me perfectly. Finally, I thought, something that clearly expresses what it feels like in my head. Bands like Slipknot, Korn, and Lamb of God became my favorites. Before I knew it, I was dressing in all black, painting my nails black, and I always had headphones in, blasting this music wherever I went. I'd sit alone in my room in the dark, listening to this sound all the time. I recently heard someone say, "You give the devil an inch and he takes a mile." It seemed like a big part of me was beginning to die, and in its place was something else entirely. And unfortunately, this was only the beginning. 1 John 3:4. Everyone who makes a practice of sinning also practices lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. So by 12, I smoked cigarettes. 13, I was smoking weed. At 14, I was getting bullied because of how much of an outcast I was. People made fake social media accounts about me, mocking me and claiming that I sacrificed pigs to Satan. My name, Jordan Antonacci, was crudely bent into Jordan Antichrist Anacci. People would steal my notebooks and draw a bunch of crosses and Christian references on all the pages, and people would openly call me names and try to fight me. At some point, I started retaliating by punching people in the face, but this blew up into me getting into a lot of fights, even with friends. Over time, I developed this me versus the world mentality. In my eyes, everyone was against me. At 15, I was stealing prescription medication from whoever I could. My friends and I would walk up alleyways and find open garages to steal alcohol from, and then go get drunk. We went to CVS on the corner almost daily, and had competitions with one another to see who could steal the most stuff. On one occasion, I skipped school and stole an MP3 player from a store. And as I was riding my bike back across the street, I got hit by a truck going about 40 to 45. By the grace of God, I only chipped a bone in my finger. On another occasion, I tried stealing another MP3 player and I got arrested. At 16, I took my mom's car and got arrested for selling weed. Being on probation, I wasn't allowed to smoke, so I leaned heavily into drinking. I'd put vodka in a water bottle and start drinking on the bus in the morning on the way to school, just so I could feel more sociable and hopefully fit in with the other students. Around this time, I was also cutting myself, and I even put a cigarette out on my arm for no reason. At 17, my social isolation and mental health were worsening. I was abusing the medication I was prescribed by my psychiatrist, and I believe this was at least contributing to these outbursts that I'd experience. My adoptive dad and I were having very frequent, horrible fights, in each other's faces, screaming as loud as we could. My mom, brothers, aunt, and cousin would have to leave the house. I was punching holes in walls, punching out windows, threatening to kill myself, and was at this point admitted to my first psychiatric facility. And I remember moments of self-awareness where I wondered, what is wrong with me? And I felt cursed, like whatever sickness lived in my dad must have been passed down to me. In a sickening desperation, I found myself wondering what a conversation with him would be like, if only to find a single person on earth to relate to, someone who understood the hell in my head. Because it felt like I was genuinely losing my mind for no reason, and there was nothing I or anyone could do about it. In my senior year, my grandmother in Tennessee was diagnosed with cancer. I dropped out of high school and moved in with her to take care of her. Several months later, she passed, and the world, my world at least, got a lot darker. Suddenly, there was no lighthouse, and into the darkness of the sea I went. At 18, my family moved from Texas to California, and I stayed in Texas and got my own apartment. I was alone, without any friends or family, and my mental health continued to decline rapidly. And during this whole time, I never remembered my relationship with Jesus, not once. In fact, the only time I ever talked about God was to insult him or defiantly question him in a purposefully antagonistic manner. And what a cold world it was, separated from the Lord. Matthew 4:7. Jesus answered him, "It is also written, 'Do not put the Lord your God to the test.'" So I was very lonely at this point in my life. It felt like I was in a glass box everywhere I went, separated from the world. I was prescribed maybe 5 different medications, but nothing seemed to be working except the Xanax, which I'd abuse. I'd always dealt with what's called intrusive thoughts. Ever since I was a little kid, it's a symptom of OCD and anxiety, both of which I'd been diagnosed with at this point. Intrusive thoughts can manifest in a lot of different ways, but for me, it had always been very random and vivid thoughts of hurting myself or others. I still experience this from time to time. It's always scared me more than anything, makes my blood run hot. My skin prickles with heat, and I have to have a distraction like the TV on at night, a comedy. And at the request of my psychiatrist, I started keeping a journal to help process some of whatever was in my head. I kept thinking back to that dream of the chanting coming from the Bible, and I somehow became convinced that it was prophesying who I was to become. Isolated in my apartment, I became obsessed with serial killers, crime shows, and horror movies. I felt this darkness inside begin to grow rapidly. One night I was arrested for paraphernalia. Next morning I bailed myself out, and Tony picked me up, and he said to me, "Maybe God is telling you to stop." Me, being the defiant kid I was, said God should be clearer. 2 hours later, my apartment was searched, and they left with my journal. A detective and 2 officers showed up at my apartment. He said to me, "I see a lot of good versus evil, light versus dark in you," in reference to the contents of my journal. Looking back, I believe this was God speaking to me, pointing out the warfare I was experiencing. An officer placed me in handcuffs, and they took me to my second psychiatric facility. A judge signed something saying I was to stay there up to 6 months, but thankfully I was out in a month after spending Thanksgiving there. At the time, I acknowledged that I had received a response from God, but it didn't hit me. I'm not sure if I just thought it was a coincidence or what, but for whatever reason, it still wasn't enough for me, and so I continued living my life unchanged. As I got older, I stopped thinking about God altogether. I moved back to my grandmother's apartment in Tennessee and was somehow able to get the exact unit she lived in. As amazing as it was far from good for my mental health. This was the apartment where my grandmother had died. There were even still markings on the walls from where my brother and I had measured our heights growing up. It was dark, but a lot of these feelings I suppressed with my addictions. I quickly saw how easy it was to find drugs in Knoxville, particularly in that complex. I realized it was more common to ask your neighbors for pills than it was to ask for milk or eggs. Soon, I had several dealers and neighbors who regularly offered me oxys in exchange for a short ride to the corner store or a doctor's appointment. Before long, drugs were all I thought about and all I wanted. I willfully became a slave to them. I'd wake up early feeling like a kid on Christmas morning, knowing I had pills waiting for me on my nightstand. And what a pitifully dreadful day it was without them. It'd be hard to wake up, and when I did, I'd find my body stiff and achy as I started to get pill sick. I'd start my day with pills and I'd end it the same way. In my head, it didn't matter if I had 0 relationships in my life because all I needed was pills. I got a job as a bagger at Kroger for $8.75, but got fired for having an attitude with customers. From there, I started finding other odd ways to make ends meet as well as fund my addiction, one of which was selling morphine pills. Rent was only $3.95 at the time, so I didn't need much. On top of this, I began escorting a prostitute. At night, I'd drive her to 2 to 3 stops in the sketchiest areas of East Knoxville and would wait in my car parked outside of a trailer, holding an open knife while she worked. I'd then drive her to her dealers, and the night would conclude with her crushing up pills on my counter, snorting them, and passing out. Sometime after this, I was still struggling with financial difficulties. I resorted to selling everything I had and living in my 2007 Kia Spectra. At my lowest point, I woke up at 5 a.m. in the Walmart parking lot to the mechanical hum of a street sweeper. And when I went to start my car, I was met with silence. It wouldn't start. Someone inside Walmart was kind enough to jump me off, but even then, my gas was on E, and I only had $5 to my name. And for the most part, this was my life. I struggled holding down jobs. I got fired a few times, and all the other times I just quit. Not even because of addictions, because I wasn't always addicted. I just struggled mentally. I've rarely experienced joy in my life, regardless of whether circumstances were good or bad. It's either been anger, anxiety, or nothingness. For most of my life, I've said I feel flat. Feigning interest in conversations, feeling passionate about anything, holding focus on what people are saying, and even faking smiles have all proved to be Goliath-like challenges for me. If I'm ever seen smiling with someone, there's a 99.9% chance that I'm faking it. I enjoyed being alone most of the time, but there were moments where I longed for connection. The only issue was that I had no friends, and my family, who I felt I didn't even fit in with, lived on the other side of the continent. So I'd sometimes try to approach people in public or reach out online, but every attempt to connect would fail horribly and leave me feeling humiliated and emptier than before. I'd beat myself up, again asking myself, what is wrong with me? And of course, the only thing I found any consolation in was pills. And it didn't matter how much I needed to spend or what I needed to do to get them, because it was all a small price to pay for what the pills offered, a sense of normality. It put the emotion in me that I lacked: happiness, calm, sociability. Still lacking faith, I rarely acknowledged God, but in my lowest moments, I'd briefly glance up to the sky and accusingly ask him, "Why did you make me like this?" Romans 9:20. But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, "Why have you made me like this?" Isaiah 43:1. But now thus says the Lord, He who created you, O Jacob, He who formed you, O Israel. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. As I got older, questions regarding the existence of God or some higher power started to enter my head. I remember saying, I can't say God doesn't exist, but I won't believe unless I see proof. So I'd shifted from atheist to agnostic. At this point, I was still living in my car. My friend had let me stay in his empty rental on occasion, but it was void of furniture and full of bugs. I'd wake up at night with roaches crawling on me. True story. So naturally, I decided it was time for a change. My family decided to move from California to Austin, Texas, and it was more affordable, so I joined because I felt I needed to be closer to family. Having an apartment again was refreshing. Living in my car had taught me to appreciate the little things like running water and a private bathroom. But the joy was short-lived. Upon arrival to Austin, I got into a bad relationship, and when it ended, I started drinking a lot. I also started to spend a lot of time on dating apps. There was a point where I was meeting up with about 3 to 4 new girls a month, so it shouldn't have been a surprise when I received the news that I was about to be a dad. And when I got that news, I felt my whole world shift because for the first time, I stepped outside of myself and genuinely considered someone else. This little unborn seed, I didn't need to know her or him yet to know that I loved them more than I'd ever loved anything or anyone. About 3 weeks before my daughter was due, I was out drinking and got COVID. This was 2021 when COVID was still sort of new and hospitals were still very strict. Throughout the whole pregnancy, I hadn't even been allowed in most checkups for my daughter. And when I got sick, I got sicker than I've ever been, even to this day. So with Raya's due date around the corner, I began a 10-day self-isolation. Day 1, I laid on the couch and turned the TV on. The TV immediately broke. You know when you're a kid and you do something you're not supposed to, like stay out all night, then you come home, you start playing games and your mom comes in and turns the TV off before giving you a stern talking to. Well, I believe God was in that apartment with me and the Lord had had enough. This was the part where God sat me down and talked to me because I was about to be a dad. I laid in silence. My fever hit 104 for a couple of days. I didn't shower or brush my teeth or eat for several days because I felt so bad. And as I sat there, my thoughts began to drift and I suddenly became plagued by this fear. What if my girlfriend gets this? I'd been seeing these stories online about COVID causing complications during pregnancy and birth. And I was like, well, what if she gets this? And what if she gets this sick? And what if something happens to her or our daughter? What if Raya comes early and I'm still too sick to be there for her? Now, I'd experienced addiction, poverty, homelessness, but I never felt as helpless as I felt in that moment. I was terrified, so naturally I felt the need to ask for help. But who could help in a situation like that? That's when, for the first time in my life, I spoke with intention a genuine prayer. Please don't let them get sick. Protect them. Later that day, I'd resorted to TikTok. Hey, I was desperate. And I saw this video. The video was of a man covered in bandages. He crawled up to the feet of Jesus and he was begging. He looked broken and ashamed. Without hesitation, Jesus reached down and healed him. Now, I was not seeking God in this period of my life. I had hope in my first prayer, but little to no faith. And I also wasn't an emotional person. People often refer to me as cold-hearted, detached, and sometimes even psychopathic. But as I saw that video, it was like I was hit by a truck with the most overwhelming sensation I'd ever experienced. And I immediately began to bawl. Not cry. I wept harder than I ever had in my adult life. Couldn't control it, couldn't explain it. And the tears weren't out of sadness or fear. To be honest, I've never been able to find words to properly describe the sensation. I could probably spend hours attempting to, but it was powerful to say the least. It felt like an undeserved mercy, an indescribably passionate, aching love. I say undeserved because I suddenly, for the first time in my life, felt hideous, dirty, and like I was in the presence of something pure that was offering something I didn't deserve, and all I could do was sit there on the ground in the middle of my apartment and weep like a baby. So while the first encounter may not have been enough for me, the second was more than enough. And a couple of weeks later, Raya was born perfectly healthy and strong. I got to be there and nobody got sick, even though we were sleeping in the same bed, sharing drinks, etc., while I was at my most contagious. And I believe at this point I could say I was a believer. And it wasn't because of someone preaching to me. It wasn't because of a church sermon. And it wasn't because of anything I read in the Bible. That experience in my apartment, what I encountered while I was sick, sinful, and afraid, was all that I needed. Just a single touch of heaven. Ecclesiastes 3:11, he makes everything beautiful in its time. So the change wasn't overnight, it was gradual, like the sculpting of a statue, a chisel here, a chisel there. I just suddenly became aware of the flaws in my ways of thinking and in my behavior. I became painfully aware of right and wrong and began experiencing guilt when I do things I knew I shouldn't. This was new to me. It was about a year after that encounter in my apartment. I'd been thinking about Jesus much more, but I hadn't yet let go of my sin and given my life to him, which I suddenly felt compelled to do. I began by getting sober. I'll keep it brief, but I went through a year of nonstop torment, withdrawing from everything. At one point, I was withdrawing from 3 different substances at once. The benzos in particular were very rough. Benzo withdrawal can kill you in extreme cases. And there's a lot of people who experience a legitimate neurological injury from benzos, which is called BIND, benzo-induced neurological dysfunction, which can take years to fully heal from. I was hardly sleeping. I'd wake up shaking like I was freezing cold, but I'd be sweating. My heart was always pounding out of my chest and skipping beats. And it was basically a 24/7 panic attack. But I learned that God does amazing things with pain. Though he may not cause it, he uses it. I didn't see it back then, but looking back now, I can see him shaping me through that pain. I was bedbound a lot. Similar to when I had COVID, this was undoubtedly another instance of God setting me down. I say that because the withdrawal, as terrifying as it was, if it had never sat me on my butt, I never would have changed in the way that I needed to. Isaiah 48:10, I have refined you in the furnace of suffering. God doesn't have a one-size-fits-all approach with how he works in our lives to transform us. He sees the heart in ways we cannot and develops a sort of treatment plan that'll strengthen us where we're weak. I began reading the Bible, studying, listening to sermons. I binged The Chosen. Passion of the Christ became my favorite movie. I began praying and worshiping daily. All of these satanic, secular music I loved so much became replaced with worship music. It became all I listened to. In 2023, I had a random vision of me being baptized in a lake in Knoxville by a family friend named Mark. In 2025, that vision came to fruition when my brother and I got baptized in the exact spot, in the exact lake, by the exact person as in my vision. The whole world faded and suddenly all I could see was Jesus. And that overwhelming sensation I felt when I had COVID, it would come back during worship and prayer. I went from someone who practically never cried to someone who couldn't do anything but cry in the presence of Jesus. The purifying white fire that is the passion of his love and the endless pursuit of my heart. I began to yearn for it, for his love, and to know him better. He became my new addiction. But there were a lot of things in life I was still struggling with. Every time I read the Bible, I found myself wrestling with God. One of these things was forgiveness. I was understanding the forgiveness of God, but I had no idea about the forgiveness that we as Christians should display to one another. As I got to know Jesus, the importance of this became apparent to me. Mark 11:25 through 26, and whenever you stand praying, if you have anything against anyone, forgive him, that your Father in heaven may also forgive your trespasses. But if you do not forgive, neither will your Father in heaven forgive your trespasses. This hit me heavily because I knew I needed forgiveness for a lot. So I went through a list of people I needed to forgive. One was my biological dad. Another was a previous boyfriend of my mom's who had put his hands on me. But I didn't just want to say, I forgive them. I wanted to feel it. It took days, but I began to empathize with these people and realized I was no better than them, and that if I was seeking forgiveness, who was I to say that they were unworthy? And I believe this was where my heart began to truly change. Ezekiel 36:26, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. Drugs, stealing, lying, satanic music, lust, cussing, pride, and judgment, it all fell from me. Suddenly I was prioritizing humbleness, forgiveness, and gratuity. But I'm not perfect. I slip up here and there. Proverbs 24:16, for though the righteous fall 7 times, they rise again. Keeping your eyes on Jesus 24/7 is hard. And you realize that by taking your eyes off him for even a moment, you risk falling back into the world and reflecting it instead of God. During these periods, I may find myself slipping back into my old ways. Proverbs 26:11, as a dog returns to its vomit, so a fool repeats his foolishness. So, like a dying man who ensures he takes his medication daily, I ensure that I, daily, follow the Lord Jesus. At the time of this recording, I've been following Jesus for over 3 years now. It's been the best decision I've made, and I will never go back. Luke 10:19, I have given you authority to trample on snakes and scorpions, to overcome all the power of the enemy. Nothing will harm you. So right after turning to Jesus, it seemed like my life became this series of unfortunate events. My car got taken, I received a notice to vacate, and my electricity was shut off all a couple of weeks before Christmas. Not much longer after this, I was fired from my job shortly before the birth of my second daughter, after asking about maternity leave. On top of this, my health never fully returned to normal after withdrawal from the benzodiazepines and alcohol. I deal with a lot of food sensitivities, and I've pretty much become allergic to the entire world. I always feel like I'm on a boat. There's ringing in my ears, muscles all over my body are constantly twitching, stabbing nerve pains, migraines, insomnia, intrusive thoughts still exist. I've had nightmares that have left such profound lingering feelings upon waking that it instinctively has made me want to die just to escape the feeling. I wake up in the middle of the night with horrible panic attacks, one of which I've actually called 911 for. In this storm that is withdrawal and recovery, God has humbled me. He stripped me of everything I enjoyed, every idol and everything that distracted me from him. I had always taken pride in my physique and how athletic I was, but in withdrawal I experienced such horrible fatigue and weakness that I could hardly make a fist or climb a flight of stairs. I've always been thin, but during withdrawal, I was quite literally skin and bone, and it was painful to look at myself in the mirror. I've always loved food and eating anything and everything all day long, yet my body suddenly became so reactive that consuming my usual diet made symptoms flare horribly. So I was forced to stop eating the foods I loved, like dark chocolate, peanut butter, and pizza, and was instead forced to stay on a very strict diet of maybe 8 whole foods. Now I could go on, but essentially withdrawal forced me to deny everything I enjoyed. It made me deny my flesh, to tune everything out so I could hear God more clearly. It taught me everything I lacked my whole life: discipline, self-control, patience, resilience, faith, and above all, humility. God sat me down and humbled me with this experience. In the furnace, he shaped me into who I needed to be, and I am forever grateful to the Lord for the work he has put into me. He is my fourth man in the fire. Joel 2:25, I will repay you for the years the locusts have eaten. Where I always struggled to fit in everywhere I went, God gave me 2 beautiful daughters who were constantly reminding me that I am loved and needed. Where I lost my job, God replaced it with a business that my family and I own. Where I lost my car, God replaced it with a new car that is almost identical to the previous, yet newer and better. Where I was homeless, sleeping with roaches, and receiving a notice to vacate, God replaced it with a house. Where I was addicted and struggling with mental health issues, I am now sober, off all medications, and dependent upon absolutely nothing but Jesus. I focus on my health, family, and the business. Overall, my goal these days is just peace. And that's not something I would have said 10 to 15 years ago. But that's the point. I am not who I was 15 years ago, because no one encounters Jesus and remains unchanged. 2 Corinthians 5:17, therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. All my life I was so lost, seeking fulfillment in drugs, music, sex, material, earthly things, only to find that these things were actually bearing me deeper and deeper into the feelings I was struggling to escape. True fulfillment never came until I met Jesus, until he met me and rescued me. Psalm 18:16, he reached down from on high and took hold of me. He drew me out of deep waters. Okay, so we made it to the end. I struggled the most writing this section because there's so much I'd like to say. I could go on and on, but the video would likely be hours long. So for the sake of brevity, I will just say this. Enter into a relationship with the Lord Jesus. Everything else will fall into place. Love Jesus and watch yourself be changed. Going to church is good, but do not let your time with him end there. Welcome him into every area of your life. Revelation 3:20, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come into him and will sup with him and he with me. Talk to him like he is your father and best friend, because he is. He loves you with a love that you cannot fathom, more than any friend, spouse, or even your parents. He loves you enough to die for you, and the creator of the universe longs for you to love him back. Will life still be hard? Yes, of course. John 16:33, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Jesus will always be in your boat, and he can calm any storm. He can also walk on water, which is pretty cool. So if you've been listening to my story and something in your heart is stirring even just a little, that's not by accident. God is closer to you than you think. And he's not waiting for you to have everything figured out. He's just asking for you to let him in, to let him work. You don't have to clean yourself up first. He will do that for you. Just come as you are, and he'll meet you there. He met me when I was a non-believing, sinful alcoholic. And if God can take the person that I was and change him into the person that I am today, then that should be proof that nothing is impossible for God. I'd just like you to know that the same peace, purpose, and transformation I have experienced is available to you too. And all you have to do is open your heart and let him in. Thank you.